Esta es la última sesión del seminario, lo cerrará el profesor Robert Wistrich, al cual tengo el placer de presentar. El profesor Wistrich es el catedrático profesor de Historia Europea y Judía en la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén y es director del Vidal Sassoon International Center de Estudios sobre el Antisemitismo. Es autor de diferentes libros, destacaré tres: Obsesión letal, antisemitismo desde la antigüedad hasta la yihad global, del año 2010. Escribió también El Laboratorio para la Destrucción Mundial, Alemanes y Judíos en Europa Central, del 2007, y Letal Obsesión, el antisemitismo desde la antigüedad hasta la yihad global. El profesor Wistrich nos hablará esta noche sobre las líneas paralelas entre el antisemitismo y el antisionismo en el mundo contemporáneo. Dada la hora, no me extiendo más. Quiero agradecer al profesor Wistrich, que viene desde Jerusalén, el esfuerzo realizado en este maratón. Mañana a las 5 de la mañana ya tiene que salir a coger el avión, o sea que acabando aquí cena un poco y prepara la maleta. Por favor, nos hablará en inglés, que es el idioma que ahora va a disertar. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all express my appreciation for this invitation which I received from Senor David Grebler, and let me thank the organizers of this symposium from which I've learned a lot and which I think has been a very important event, particularly taking place here in Barcelona and in Spain. Many things have been said already in the course of this day which make it difficult for myself, coming last as it were, and with the hour being late, to A, keep your attention, B, say something that you haven't heard before, and thirdly, to try and give a broad, more global perspective on many of the themes that have been discussed so ably by others. My subject, as you heard, is parallel lines, and perhaps this is the main difference, a difference in nuance and emphasis, not an essential difference from the previous contributions, because I have one specific focus to my remarks this evening: the relationship, the complex relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I'm not attempting to explain all the many ramifications of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism as such. I did that in the book, which you kindly referred to, A Lethal Obsession. That is a book of 1,200 pages. So it's the longest book ever written about anti-Semitism. And I could have added another 1,200 pages without any difficulty, but the publisher said, stop now. They're probably regretting that they published a book of that length now. There have been many classical forms of anti-Semitism, or Judeophobia, as some prefer to call it, extending back more than 2,000 years. And one of the features of classical anti-Semitism that I think it's important to underline, and perhaps it wasn't said sufficiently to this point, is that the remarkable persistence and near ubiquity of anti-Semitism across space and time, in so many different societies with vastly different social systems, across different cultures, different religious affiliations, that its persistence and its survival already distinguish it from other forms of religious, ethnic, racial, political hatred. In a book I wrote 21 years ago, which was also the basis of a film documentary, I called it the longest hatred. I coined that phrase. And I believe it to be true. It is the longest known form of group hatred. So clearly, in any discussion of its contemporary manifestations, we have to take into account its sheer longevity. Anti-Zionism, on the other hand, in comparison with the longest hatred, is a relatively recent phenomenon. We could say that its origins go back more or less to the end of the 19th century, with the emergence of political Zionism itself. In other words, it is the decade of the 1890s in Europe which sees the birth of anti-Zionism. And it has to be said from a historical point of view, and I am a historian, and I certainly try to respect the rules of historical research. Anti-Zionism in its origins was very different from anti-Semitism. In some respects, it was even opposed to it. And anti-Zionism in its first phase or stage, which I would say ran roughly from the middle of the 1890s until the end of the First World War, anti-Zionism was predominantly a Jewish phenomenon. Although that's not my subject today, just to remind ourselves that majority opinion within the Jewish communities around the world was not particularly sympathetic to Zionism, in many cases strongly opposed to it. If you look at the religious aspect, the Reform Judaism of the late 19th century, whether in the United States or in Europe, it was born in Germany in the 1840s, Reform Judaism was militantly anti-Zionist. Orthodox Judaism, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the Jewish masses lived at that time, Orthodox Judaism considered Zionism, and especially political Zionism, to be a heresy, to be something in conflict or contradiction with their understanding of traditional Judaism. They considered it even as a false Messiah. Liberal assimilationist opinion, both in Europe and in the Americas, was also anti-Zionist. One of the reasons for that was the fear, which has not entirely disappeared, of many Jews living in the diaspora, that if they adopted this particular form of Jewish nationalism, it would strengthen the charge of dual loyalties, that they were not only loyal to the country in which they lived, but they had another loyalty which was even greater. So many liberal and particularly assimilationist Jews, or simply Jews who sought full integration in the societies they lived in, were very suspicious of Zionism. There was also a powerful current in the Jewish proletarian movement of that generation and between the two world wars. A movement known as the Bund. It was a Jewish labor movement, very strong in Poland and in Tsarist Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. Jewish socialists of that kind were militantly anti-Zionist. They attacked Zionism as a petty bourgeois utopia, as something disconnected from the real life of working Jews. They considered that Zionism was a betrayal of the class struggle which they were advocating within the Jewish communities. In comparison with Jewish anti-Zionism of that era, Arab anti-Zionism, Palestinian Arab anti-Zionism, was relatively restrained. It existed, but until the Balfour Declaration of 1917, it was not very vocal. Remember that Palestine was not then and never has been ruled by Palestinians, by which I mean Arab Palestinians. There's a lot of confusion in that terminology. It was ruled by the Ottoman Turks. Ottoman Turkey ruled Palestine for 400 years until they were defeated by the British. With the help of the Australians and New Zealanders, they conquered Palestine at the end of 1917. There were other forms of anti-Zionism. We don't need to go into that now. There was a Catholic form of anti-Zionism quite strong in France at that time. There were other examples. But the main point I want to make is that until the establishment of Israel in 1948, most of the Jewish world remained at least indifferent and in some cases hostile to Zionism. That only began to change in the 1930s with the rise of Hitlerism and the obvious implications of the fact that Jews were desperate to get out of Germany and then Austria, and there was nowhere for them to go in many cases because the doors of other European countries and the doors of the United States and of Canada and of Australia and almost every potential home were being slammed in their faces. And since 1918 and since 1922, when it was ratified by the League of Nations and therefore had the legitimacy of international law, the Balfour Declaration made by the British became the British mandate for Palestine that was authorized by the community of nations unanimously at that time. And why was it authorized? Because all the nations who voted for it in 1922 ratified the mandate for Palestine. They said that Palestine must become a Jewish national home. They gave the mandate to Great Britain solely and exclusively in order to implement the ideal of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So anyone who says, and they say it all the time, people who should know better, they say that the Zionist idealism is a much more recent phenomenon than anti-Semitism. However, in the period between the two world wars, as the British mandate in Palestine was gradually implemented and the beginnings, the foundations of a Jewish national home were established, Arab opposition, the opposition of the local Palestinian Arabs and of the larger Arab world, which was not yet fully independent, which was still under colonial domination, predominantly of Britain and of France, intensified. And here we see already in the 1920s, and even more in the 1930s, the emergence of an anti-Zionism which becomes increasingly linked to, overlapping with, and converging with anti-Semitism. One of the, perhaps the most important single example is that the leader of the undisputed leader of the Palestine Arab national movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who led this movement, the official national movement of the Palestinian Arabs, for 40 years, from 1920 until roughly 1960. This man, after a careful study of his works, and based also on the work of a number of biographers and historians and the release of German and other documents, because the Arabic documents are not by and large released, it is quite clear that Haj Amin al-Husseini was not merely an anti-Semite by European standards, certainly, but he was a genocidal anti-Semite. In other words, Haj Amin regarded, this came out really in the Second World War, he regarded the mass murder of European Jews as a good thing. He knew about it, he was well informed, he collaborated with the Nazis, he spent 4 years in Berlin from 1941 to 1945. He broadcast Nazi-like propaganda to the Arab world in Arabic, in which constantly there were calls to kill the Jews wherever you find them. And he fully backed German Nazism and to a degree Italian fascism, and received support in his aim, his primary aim, which was to totally destroy the Jewish national home in Palestine. Those are facts. They are indisputable facts, largely covered up for many, many years, although they've been known about. That is an example where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism basically fuse together, they coalesce, they become indistinguishable. It is also true when we look at many Arab nationalist leaders of the 1930s that anti-Semitism becomes an important part of their anti-Zionist program. This is more or less 15 years before the establishment of Israel. Iraq would be a good example. In Iraq, Nazi influence from roughly 1933 becomes extremely significant. The Iraqi Minister of Education is an out supporter of the Nazi model. In 1941, 1st of June 1941, when the British had briefly lost control of Iraq, which was a very important military base for them during World War II, there is a new government which only survives for a month, which is pro-Nazi in Iraq. It's led by Rashid Ali al-Kailani. Later, he goes to Berlin as well and joins the Mufti in broadcasts to the Arab world. And a pogrom is carried out in the middle of World War II in Baghdad against the largest, the most prosperous, the most successful, and the most integrated Jewish community in the entire Arab world. It's a pretty devastating pogrom. It is the Arab Kristallnacht. It's one which is never talked about, or very rarely, called in Arabic Al-Farhud. The British army is standing on the outskirts of Baghdad and does not intervene. This is something that Britain did at least 3 or 4 times in the Middle East, basically having armed forces which watched while Arab mobs plundered, slaughtered, raped any Jews they could find. It happened in Libya in 1945. Happened in Aden in 1947. But that's another story. Anyone who tells you that relationships between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East, until the emergence of Zionism or the establishment of Israel in particular, were basically warm, friendly, even idyllic, is not telling the truth, or at least telling a very, very partial story. The position of the Jewish communities in the Arab world by 1948 was basically untenable before Israel was founded. As I said before, pogroms broke out across the Arab Middle East between 1945 and 1948 in almost every country. If we examine other parts of the world and ask ourselves, when does anti-Zionism begin to become anti-Semitic? The position is more complicated. In Europe, obviously, if we take the Nazi example, we can see convergence quite early. Already in 1920, the leading ideologue of National Socialism in Germany, Alfred Rosenberg, writes a book, it's a short book, entitled Der staatsfeindliche Zionismus, Zionism as an enemy of the state, meaning the German state, the German Reich. Adolf Hitler, if you read Mein Kampf, has a couple of pages about Zionism. It's a secondary, a minor issue in comparison with the rabid, extremist, fanatical Jew hatred that runs all the way through that book. But it's still there. And what does he say about Zionism? He doesn't say what a number of left-wing propagandists claim today. He doesn't say that Zionism has anything in common with National Socialism or with fascism. He says the opposite. He says that Zionism pretends to be a movement of Jewish national self-determination with a desire to establish its homeland in Palestine. But this is a lie. What Hitler says is this is a fabrication, because the real aim of the Zionists is to seize and control the entire world. And Palestine is only intended to be one more power center for them to fulfill their plan of world domination. In other words, the position of Hitler and of the Nazi movement on the whole, and the position of many fascists in that era, was that Zionism is a part of the Jewish world conspiracy. This is the scenario of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Russian fabrication, which became very popular after the First World War across Europe, especially in Germany, but also in other countries, including Britain and the United States for a time. Henry Ford, the American millionaire, was a great propagator of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that is the thesis that the Nazis embraced. They directly associated Zionism with the Protocols. And that is still the dominant view across the Arab world and in large chunks of the Muslim world today. Remember that the Muslim world It's far, far bigger than the Arab world, and we must not confuse the two things. Very often people talk as if this is the same thing. That is nonsense. The Arabs are a small minority in the larger Muslim world, maybe 20%, no more. The fact that the Palestinian cause has completely monopolized and dominated attention is a huge distortion of the problems of the Muslim world, for which they're paying a heavy price. But many Muslims outside of the Arab world have adopted the theories of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is today, even today, in the year 2012, a widely circulated, popular, sometimes even a best-selling book. There are 60 different editions in Arabic of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I can tell you, having traveled to a number of Arab capitals, that it's very easily obtainable in bookshops, unlike in the West. So here we have a case where anybody who believes in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion has basically fused together anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as one single concept. I mentioned that the protocols were made in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. But it's interesting to look at their history in the Soviet Union. The previous lecture, you heard a number of things that were said about the Soviet Union. I would like to perhaps extend that a little bit. Until roughly 1950, you had two strands in Soviet policy towards Zionism. There was one dominant strand which was ideological. It was a classical Marxist-Leninist position. And what did it say? That Zionism is a form of bourgeois or petty bourgeois reaction that contradicts the class struggle, similar things to what the Jewish Bund had argued before the First World War. That Zionism, this is particularly after 1920, this is the official position of the Communist International, the Comintern, that Zionism is an instrument and an agent of Western imperialism. And the Balfour Declaration and the reality of a British mandate seem to confirm that the imperialists, quote unquote, and the Zionists are working together. And the Comintern line was, we have to mobilize, we have to rally the Arab masses against Zionism and imperialism in order to convert them to communism. And that was their position until roughly 1947. And then came the great surprise when in the United Nations, Palestine was being discussed. The partition of Palestine was on the agenda. And suddenly, the Soviet delegate, Andrei Gromyko, makes an amazingly pro-Zionist, quote-unquote, speech in which he says that due to the terrible sufferings of the Jewish people during the Holocaust and the fact that no Western country had been able or willing to defend their rights, the Jews deserve and must have a homeland, and it must be in Palestine because the Jews have a historic connection to Palestine which is indisputable. Gromyko wiped out in one speech 30 years of communist propaganda and indoctrination about the nature of Zionism, recognized the historic connection of the Jews to Palestine, their right to be there, their right to national self-determination, and to an independent state. As a result, not only did the Soviet Union, but also all the satellite East European states fall in line and supported Zionism. Even the Communist Party in Palestine, which had been militantly anti-Zionist throughout its history, had no choice but to accept this. And in Europe, even completely Stalinized communist parties like the French Communist Party supported the foundation of Israel enthusiastically. Within 2-3 years, this was becoming history. The closer that the USSR moved towards the Arab world, it took time. It took 5-6 more years until this alliance solidified in 1955 with an arms treaty that went through Czechoslovakia to arm Egypt, Nasser's Egypt. What is interesting is that Stalin, in his last years, he died in March 1953. By the way, he died on Purim, which, as you know, is a Jewish holiday where you celebrate your liberation from persecutors and oppressors. Well, it's an extraordinary fact that Stalin died on Purim, because if he hadn't died on Purim, then he was definitely in the process of planning a Soviet-style final solution of the Jewish question in the USSR. That would not have been a Nazi type of solution, but it would have involved mass deportation of Jews to Siberia and Kazakhstan, where I was born, by the way. Stalin, in his last years, became a fanatical and rabid anti-Semite. We don't know if he was that way before. If he was, he disguised it remarkably well. We don't have solid proof until probably the middle of the Second World War. And even then, Stalin, unlike Hitler, when involved in a desperate life and death struggle of the Soviet Union for survival, Stalin fully utilized the services of Soviet Jews. There were Jews in the Soviet Union who commanded the Air Force, who were in high positions in the army, and still in many areas of cultural life, in key fields like nuclear physics, etc., etc. So Stalin was an anti-Semite, but it did not immediately interfere in every aspect of decision-making. But the anti-Semitism becomes very pronounced in the last 2-3 years of his life. And there is a key moment, which I would say is the beginnings of the fusion of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on the left, primarily on the communist left. And that is the Prague show trial of 1952. We are November the 8th, 2012. We are exactly 60 years on from what was, I think, a key turning point. Because in the capital of Czechoslovakia, the very country which had sent arms to Israel during the War of Independence at a critical stage, obviously with the approval of Stalin, only 4 years later, Czechoslovakia and Prague is selected very deliberately, very consciously, to become a theater for the denunciation of Zionism, of world Zionism, as a treasonous conspiracy against the USSR, against the entire socialist, quote, quote-unquote camp, the socialist camp. Zionism is presented as a lackey of American imperialism. It is argued that the leaders of Czechoslovakia, of communist Czechoslovakia, of whom a majority were Jewish in origin at that point, that they were Zionists since their early years, and they had deliberately handed over secrets and sacrificed the interests of their countries for Zionist aims. Rudolf Slansky, who was the leader of communist Czechoslovakia, who had been an anti-Zionist all his life, was hanged for treason and services to Zionism, which was, of course, a total fabrication from beginning to end. Along with him, there were 15 defendants in this trial. 12 others were Jewish. They selected the Jews. And with one exception, all of them were hanged. These were show trials. The propaganda that was issued at that time created an incredibly anti-Semitic mood in Czechoslovakia, a country which was not considered among East European countries to be particularly anti-Semitic. But this was fabricated, state-controlled anti-Zionism that produced virulent, popular anti-Semitism. The same thing would happen again in Poland in 1968. 1 year after the Six-Day War, the communist leadership in Poland initiated a witch hunt against the 30,000 Jews who still remained in Poland after 90% of Polish Jewry had been wiped out, annihilated during the Holocaust. And after several hundred thousand Jews had left post-war Poland, again, largely because of the vicious anti-Semitism that developed despite the Holocaust. The Holocaust had no influence whatsoever on Polish attitudes to Jews after 1945. In many respects, they were worse than they had been before the war, which is another myth we need to get rid of. If anybody tells you that because of the Holocaust in Europe, suddenly attitudes changed towards Jews dramatically, that's a wild overstatement. Here and there were people of conscience who were changed. They were a minority. And in many countries, the anti-Semitism was worse than it had previously been. And in the Zionist context, just remember the following point. Great Britain still controlled Palestine in 1945. After the full knowledge and liberation of the death camps had occurred, and some of the concentration camps in Germany have been liberated by British troops, including Bergen-Belsen. Did this change or influence British policy in any way? The answer is no, absolutely no. British policy towards Palestine between 1945 and 48 was callous, cruel, and in the extreme. The Royal Navy hunted down every rickety vessel that was carrying survivors of the Holocaust to the shores of Palestine and then deported them to concentration camps in Cyprus, or even as in the case of the famous Exodus boat that arrived in Haifa, they took the survivors off the ship by force, put them in cages, and sent them on ships back to Germany, Hamburg, Germany. So tell me, how was Great Britain influenced by the Holocaust? Its policy was draconian. It was brutal in the extreme, which is why the Jewish Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, rose in resistance against Britain in 1945 in order to put a stop to this policy, which was purely and solely motivated by imperial realpolitik and the desire at all costs to rebuild Britain's position in the Middle East by appeasing the Arab world. Let me move on towards more recent times. There is no doubt that anyone who follows what passes today for anti-Zionist rhetoric, anti-Zionist literature, and books, of which there are thousands available in many different languages, no one can doubt that a considerable amount of this literature, although not all of it, can be described as being influenced by anti-Jewish symbols, stereotypes, cliches, which have come down to us over the centuries. Some of the examples you've already heard, and I do not wish to repeat them. Let's take a couple of very recent examples, which are really quite close to you here in Barcelona. One of the most dramatic events that occurred during this year, 2012, occurred in neighboring France, and possibly will have important consequences, even though it's too early to predict. I'm referring, first of all, to what took place in Toulouse, in southwestern France. As you know, this was really an unprecedented escalation in the post-war period, involving the brutal murder, assassination of 3 young Jewish children aged 4, 6, 8, a young rabbi aged 30 in a Jewish school in Toulouse in broad light of day, assassinated at point-blank range, and the assassin, who had previously also killed, one should mention that, 3 French soldiers in uniform who actually had a Maghrebin or North African background, was associated with Al-Qaeda, a 24-year-old French Muslim of Algerian background, Mohammed Merah, who had been in training camps in Pakistan and Afghanistan, who was involved in a network. But I only want to focus on one aspect for the purposes of this conference. He was quoted as saying, during the period of the siege before he was shot by French police, that his only regret about this action was that he had not succeeded in killing far more Jewish children. He also made the fairly characteristic excuse of saying, I killed them in revenge for the deaths of Palestinian children in Gaza. Like he killed the French Muslim soldiers because they had served or were going to serve with the French army in Afghanistan, a Muslim country. Well, even Le Monde, which as you know is an important newspaper, but has never been particularly distinguished by its love of Israel, even Le Monde wrote a very severe and appropriate editorial in October of this year, in which it rubbished these kinds of pretexts and excuses and said, this really has got to stop. This young man, Mohamed Merah, committed these crimes in France, on French soil. He's a product of France, even though he's a Muslim who had converted to jihadism. And there can be no justifications, no explanations, certainly none of these pseudo-psychological or pseudo-sociological explanations which talk about alienation and the failure of integration of Muslims in France. These are facts and they have to be dealt with, but they should never, ever be used as any kind of justification for what is the worst kind of cowardly murder imaginable. And more recently, a terrorist network was found in Strasbourg. Again, this Jeremy Louis Sidney, who was shot in this encounter after he opened fire on the police. They found blacklists of what this terrorist cell of young men, all of them recent converts to Islam, French citizens converted to Islam, were planning to do. They linked them to an incident in September in Sarcelles, northern suburb of Paris, which has a very large Jewish community, where a grenade had been thrown into a grocery, a Jewish grocery shop. And they linked the leader of this group to that attack. And they found this blacklist contained only Jewish names and names of Jewish organizations that were going to be targeted and, if possible, killed. This is now a real threat, a real possibility taken very seriously in France after years of neglect, of denial, refusing to say that anti-Semitism even exists in the country. Even 10 years ago, when Jewish synagogues were being burned, when Jewish community centers were being attacked across France, when Jewish individuals were the objects of attack. The president, the then president of France, M. Chirac, said, "Il n'y a pas d'antisémitisme en France." There is no anti-Semitism in France. Well, that denial is over. The socialist president of France, to his credit, François Hollande, categorically, unequivocally denounced these actions and took real steps to ensure the security of Jewish communities across the country. This is important, but in my view, it will not stop the problem, because in a way, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but in a way, it's too late to really get this under control. What can be done is containment, efforts to neutralize, obviously to continue to educate in a much more forceful, intensive, systematic way. All these things need to be done, and they probably will slowly begin to be done under the pressure of such atrocities. But at a point where you already have at least 6 million Muslims in France, a long way from being adequately and successfully integrated into the society. It only needs a small minority, because I don't believe the majority of Muslims identify, the majority of Muslims living in France identify with such actions. Of course they don't. But let's imagine that we're talking about 1% who identify. 1% out of 6 million. That's a lot of people. And that's what we have to realize to understand the gravity And for them, there's no distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. They attack Jewish targets. They don't attack Zionist targets in France or other European countries. They don't attack Israeli targets. They attack Jewish targets because Jews and Israel are the same thing. Because little children of 3 to 4 years old, in this jihadist worldview, they are soldiers to be killed by the soldiers of Allah. Because that is what Mohammed Merah regarded himself as, and that is the way that all the jihadists and all the Salafists, who are now a real force in the Middle East and are a growing force in the Muslim diaspora in Europe, that's what they believe. And we have to start taking seriously what they believe. Respect what they say, however abominable it is. Listen to them. Don't impose sociological and other political science type of models in order to explain it away. Listen to what they say. And then perhaps there's a chance to neutralize their actions. A number of things were said in a previous lecture, and I want to reinforce that briefly, about anti-Semitism being fundamentally a form of demonizing the Jews. The real danger of anti-Semitism lies precisely there. It is not simply an opinion, it's not simply a prejudice or a product of ignorance, although all those things are there, nor is it only a result of fear of the Jews, or fantasies about Jewish power, although those fantasies play an important role, and always have done. It is fundamentally about a perception and a depiction of the Jews as demons, as children of the devil, of Satan. This is what Catholic Christianity bequeathed to Europe, and a large element of Protestant Christianity after the Reformation also took it on board. Not all Protestants, but certainly those who followed, for instance, Martin Luther in Germany, completely shared this view that the Jews are the allies of Satan. And they are acting in every way possible to undermine the church, to undermine the Christian faith and the basis of society. In Islam today, we have something similar. We have the satanization of the Jews. It comes out in countless sermons, in cassettes, in what is written in the newspapers, in the caricatures across the Arab world. Unfortunately, as part of my job as the director of the International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, I look at a lot of videos that come out of the Arab world from different television stations. They're easily accessible, and you can even get them in translation, thanks to the work of the Middle East Research Institute, MEMRI. And it is not only chilling, even though I'm personally used to it now, I've seen it so many times that nothing will surprise me, but it's still chilling. Because you see imams, you see sheikhs, you see religious figures of authority, whether it's on Saudi TV, whether it's the Palestinian Authority, whether it's the Hamas TV, whether it's Egyptian or Syrian, doesn't matter. Jordan. You see calls to murder. You see the Jews being systematically defamed and dehumanized in a way that, frankly, I have to tell you, makes Nazi propaganda look amateurish. And the calls to murder are more direct because Nazi propaganda, which I studied very closely, given courses about it, and I think I'm fairly familiar with the method and the technique. Nazi propaganda, however vicious and repulsive it was in its portrayal of the eternal Jew, the Jew as a monster, as a devil, as this conspiring fiend. The Nazis were careful when it came to calls for murder. They disguised that. That's why the mass murder of Jews, although it was not unknown to the German public, it was always presented in a veiled way. They used euphemisms. They used a language which didn't say, we are now in the process of mass murdering the Jews of Europe. They used a more abstract language. They used codes. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, they talked about the Endlösung, the final solution. That's an abstract term. It doesn't mean people couldn't understand it, but it's not the same as saying we are now in the process of, or we've just killed, 2 million Jews in Poland. They didn't do that. And in their propaganda, they also stopped short of saying that. When I look at Arab and particularly Islamist propaganda, but not only Islamist, they do say it. And they're very open about it. Now let me give you an example of somebody who's mainstream. These are not extremists. This is also a very harmful, misleading categorization. The fact that a president of the United States who's now been re-elected for 4 years used these characterizations, never ever used the word Islam in respect to terrorism, is a disservice, a serious and grave disservice to understanding what is really happening. In this Islamist propaganda, to call the Jews the sons of apes and pigs, which is actually a verse from the Quran, it's in the Quran, that is comparatively mild. It's not the worst thing by any means, although it's constantly repeated, even by little children who were taught on TV programs to say this. Say the Jews are the sons of apes and pigs, and the interviewer says to a 3-year-old on Saudi TV, how do you know? And she says, because it's in the Quran. And he smiles and he says, very good. You have calls to murder. You have incitement to murder of Jews, because the Jews are considered subhuman. The Jews are the scum of humanity. The Jews are treacherous, vile, lowly, despicable. They break their covenants. They lie without shame. They steal. They rob. They commit ritual murder. On Arab television programs, it is possible to see Jews actually committing ritual murder within the framework of a film, of course. One of the most notorious examples was an Egyptian film that was shown, the first time it was shown about 9 years ago in Egypt. It was called Horseman Without a Horse. And it's modeled on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's about a group of Egyptian Jews who are plotting, and there's one scene in it where they actually carry out a ritual murder of a Jew, not of a Jewish, but of a Gentile child. It's interesting because this has its roots in the medieval Christian world, and there's no theological or religious basis for it in Islam whatsoever, but it's been borrowed, it's been adopted, it's been adapted to the needs of Islamic and Arab propaganda. This is obviously not anti-Zionism. This is genocidal anti-Semitism. This is a call for murder, an incitement. Because if this is what Jews do, then there is nothing that Jews are not capable of doing, because Jews themselves are murderers. They are murderers of children. And if we take it at a more secular, political level, we see that in much of the Arab propaganda, which has been accepted in parts of the European discourse, both on the left and the right, and even in the liberal center in some cases, we see the portrayal, for example, of the Israeli army when it is involved in armed conflict, in wars, that it is presented as if it is an army of child murderers. And this is what happened in the Gaza campaign, but it happened before then. When the Israeli army has to deal with areas in which the adversary has placed its armaments, its missiles, deliberately in civilian areas, and in areas where there are women and children, and done or even in mosques. When this is done, then of course there is a risk, and it has happened, that innocent civilians will in fact be killed, despite the fact that Israel's army went to great lengths, maybe unprecedented lengths, to give warnings that all civilians should be evacuated because we are going to bomb this area. This was the basis of the Goldstone report that accused Israel of war crimes, but then subsequently Judge Goldstone himself admitted that much of this report was flawed and was inaccurate. But what I want to say is, an image is created, and I think in a very malevolent way. It is really a wicked, malevolent form of reporting when you avoid telling the audience what are the circumstances in which certain actions cause civilian casualties, and then imply that war crimes are being committed, and always the finger of accusation is directed against the Jews. This is anti-Semitism of a new kind, which uses a facade, a politically correct language of anti-Israel sentiment. And this leads me to a very straightforward observation, but one which I think has not been made thus far in this conference. Anti-Semitism of the classical or traditional kind and Holocaust denial in a number of European countries is considered a punishable offense. It varies in different European countries, don't have the same legislation. But if you make an openly, undisputably anti-Semitic statement in public, you could be prosecuted. It depends, but there is a possibility. If you're a politician and you make such a statement, it might even be the end of your political career. But the problem which is avoided, is that most of the really objectionable and demonological statements about Jews today are made with regard to Israel and Zionism. And that is not only unpunishable, there is no legal recourse to it, cannot be challenged, nobody can be asked to defend themselves except in very, very rare circumstances. It has happened here and there, but it's very difficult to bring any prosecution, to have any recourse to a statement that demonizes or vilifies the state of Israel or Zionism. This is considered to be covered by free speech, to be a legitimate opinion, and in many cases is applauded. You are considered a member of the progressive camp. You're considered sometimes as an enlightened person if you make such statements. So the problem then becomes that most of the more dangerous forms of anti-Semitism today, in practice, go through this channel, the very channel against which it is extremely difficult to respond, certainly impossible or virtually impossible to counteract by legal methods. In other words, you can make extreme, untruthful, mendacious comments, as happens if you go on the internet of some of the major newspapers in Europe today, and you see their sections of the responses of readers. Much of the comment about Israel, and I think you had some examples from the previous talk, is simply not merely offensive, it is obscene. It is actually, I would consider it, one of the low-grade forms of pornography in our time. This type of anti-Semitism, which is literally intoxicating the atmosphere so that it becomes almost impossible to have a rational, civil debate about the realities of the Middle East and what each of the parties are responsible for. And when I say that, of course, I'm not implying, nor do I think, never have I believed, that everything that Israel does is right or justified or should not be subjected to criticism. But I make a very big distinction between criticism, which is essential, which is normal, which is practiced every day inside Israeli society, and anyone who knows Israeli politics knows just how fierce the criticism within the country is of many of the things that are done by this or that government. Anyone who knows Israeli democracy and the way it works realizes that. But the so-called criticism from outside is not criticism in the sense that it's normally understood. Much of it, if not most of it, is really an attempt to undermine the moral and historical and political legitimacy of the existence of Israel. It's another way of saying this country, it's not a normal country. It's actually a criminal entity. It's essentially, in its actions, in its essence, it's criminal. That is exactly the same method that anti-Semites always used in relation to the Jews as a community, as individuals, as an ethnic group, as a religion. They attacked the Jewish essence. They said the character of the Jews is fundamentally flawed or wicked or distorted or ugly or evil. And this is the language that's directed at Israel in a way that it's directed at no other country. You heard already today, and I would repeat it, For its size, the size of its population, the size of the country, a very narrow waste of a land, 10 miles wide at many points. This small country, depicted as if it's the Fourth Reich by anti-Zionists who are really anti-Semites. This country has given, in its short history of 65 years, it has given more to humanity than any other country of comparable size. And you can see that in its phenomenal scientific and technological achievements, in the high caliber of its universities. You can see it in the fact that it has an independent judiciary. In a country that has had to fight 7 wars for its survival, it has maintained the rule of law. It's a country which is light years ahead of all its Arab neighbors when it comes to issues of treatment of minorities, status of women, freedom of speech, freedom of criticism, observing the democratic rules of the game. This, in a country that has had to fight continual wars of survival, when you look at what Western democracies, how they responded in wartime, for instance, in World War II, when it came to the suspension of various civic freedoms that have been established over many years, you see that Israel, in fact, has been exceptional in its defense of liberties. So it has its flaws. It has things which I personally, like many others, would like to see changed, but changed democratically, and not changed as a result of threats of annihilation from outside, from people who are light years away from anything, as in the case of Iran, that has any connection with human liberty or democratic rights. And yet, the world, the democratic world in particular, that should be ashamed of itself, has turned on this one country, turned it into a kind of pariah, and the Jew of the nations. That's what Israel has become for certain people. Certainly for the anti-Zionists, it goes without saying. And there are many of them. And they're proud to be anti-Zionist. Because to say you're a Zionist is to take a risk. To say you're a Zionist is to risk being abused. But to say you're an anti-Zionist is to be awarded high honors and prizes and all kinds of, I would say, you enjoy all the status and the privileges of being part of progressive mankind. One of those old Soviet cliches that has been taken over by a large part of the left. So, I guess I should be concluding. What has happened to the left in particular, and this is the point on which I would like to conclude, is something that I have documented and analyzed in my most recent book, which is not a single entity. There are communists, there are social democrats, there are anarchists, there are anti-globalists, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, increasingly, in recent times, we've seen an astonishing conformity of opinion, both in the radical left and increasingly in parts of the mainstream left, when it comes to Israel. And the worst aspect of this groupthink, this conformism, of people who like to pride themselves how critical they are when they think like a herd. They all think the same way, and there must be something wrong with that. So what do they say? They use the technique, which is a fascist and a Stalinist technique, of the amalgam. They say Zionism is like a false mathematical equation. They say Zionism equals fascism. equals colonialism, equals racism, equals apartheid state, equals ethnic cleansing, equals oppression of the Palestinians, and in the more extreme cases, equals Nazism. That is the contribution of most left-wing thought, of what passes for left-wing thought, because it's not thought at all. It's just ideology and dogma gone mad. This is the message of a significant portion of the left. Not all the left, thank God, because the left would be finished, doomed, if that was the position of the whole left. This is the betrayal that I'm talking about. And this is the complicity that they have in their support of the unsupportable, in their tolerance of the intolerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bueno, passem ara, tenim 10 minuts per fer preguntes. Qui vol fer una pregunta concreta i ràpida?
Not any question, just to say thank you. Keep on working that hard. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por su conferencia y me gustaría hacerle una pregunta. Se ha hablado de la influencia de las ideas de la Alemania nazi en el mundo árabe y me gustaría preguntarle qué papel jugó la hermandad musulmana, los hermanos musulmanes de Hassan al-Banna, en la introducción de esas ideas, de esa propaganda nazi en el mundo árabe, y también la influencia de la hermandad musulmana en el nacionalismo, en el incipiente nacionalismo palestino. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay. Thank you for reminding me of something that I had intended to mention but somehow forgot to do so. With regard to the Muslim Brotherhood, as you all know, this is an organization that has now come to power, is in power, in Egypt, the largest Arab nation. The Muslim Brothers are the oldest Islamist organization in the world. They were founded in 1928. You mentioned the name of their leader, Hassan al-Banna, who was a school teacher in Egypt at that time, which was largely under British colonial domination. This movement became increasingly powerful in the 1930s already. There are estimates that say that in 1938 in Egypt, they already had something like 200,000 members, which was one of the early peaks of their influence. From the mid-1930s, they were very mobilized in the cause of Palestine. They collected money to support the Palestinian Arab revolt against the British Mandate and obviously against Zionism that took place between 1936 and 1939. The Muslim Brothers sent many volunteers in 1948 to fight in Palestine. They were extremely active. They were also an anti-Semitic organization from, I would say, about 1933 or 34. I think they were influenced to a degree, by what was happening in Nazi Germany, which they certainly didn't oppose. However, to be fair, I would say that they were less pro-Nazi than some of the Arab nationalist, secular nationalist, or pan-Arab movements in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt itself, and so forth, or in Palestine. They were less pro-Nazi, but extremely anti-Semitic. Now, if we go to the 1950s, the most important ideologist of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, was a thinker called Sayyid Qutb, who is immensely influential, although he died, or he didn't die, he was executed by Nasser in 1966. But Sayyid Qutb is immensely influential on all fundamentalists around the Arab world and beyond to this day. Even the Shiites read Sayyid Qutb, of course was a Sunni Muslim, and his view of the Jews is quite revealing. Of course, his overall vision is, as with all the Islamists, Islam is the solution. The Arab world can resolve its problems only by returning to Sharia law, by re-establishing the caliphate. These are common demands of all Islamists and Salafists and so on. But he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was their leading thinker at that time. He wrote a pamphlet, it's about 40 pages long, which was published in Saudi Arabia by his brother later. His brother went to Saudi Arabia, that's probably why he wasn't executed. Sayyid Qutb wrote this work called Our Struggle with the Jews. It's very revealing to read this work, because it's not just that Sayyid Qutb was anti-Semitic, that's obvious from the title, right? It's the kind of anti-Semitism, what it's based on. It's a curious mixture of Islamic quotations from the Quran, from the Hadith, from various religious sources, with Western anti-Semitic literature, including the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But what he really says is this: the very existence of Israel in the Middle East is the proof that we Muslims have failed. We have gone from the right path. We are paying the price for our own corruption, for our own deviation. We have followed the Western model, which has corrupted us. Our rulers are not real Muslims. They are fake Muslims. This is the message of Qutb, and it's the message of his followers. And all the secular rulers who were more or less dictators of the Arab world in his time, of course, and included Nasser, they have landed us where we are. But only by mobilizing our spiritual resources, and that means Islam and his interpretation of Islam, which is a very fundamentalist view, where the model is the early centuries of Islam. That's what we have to go back to. Only when we recover that can we actually cleanse our own societies and cleanse the Middle East of the Jews, because remember, the fundamentalist Muslim thought, almost without exception, is of the opinion that only by complete cleansing of the Middle East of any Jewish political entity, and certainly of Israel, can the Muslim world come back to itself, recover its identity, its religious, its spiritual, its cultural identity. And equally, it has to expel any Western influence. And any Muslims who are influenced by the West are heretics. That is the position, I think, of the Muslim Brotherhood as well. Now, if you look at today, at the leaders of the Brotherhood, because Morsi, who came from the Brotherhood, of course, is now president of Egypt, so he doesn't actually rule Egypt in the name of the Brotherhood, even though he appoints all kinds of people in all the key positions who he can rely on, who are with him. But he will not make anti-Semitic statements directly now that he's president. But there are plenty of other people in leading positions in the Brotherhood who do. And for them, Israel is anathema. The only reason that the peace treaty with Israel has not been abolished is obvious and well known. Because if American aid to Egypt stopped tomorrow, and they get billions from the United States, then Egypt would sink into the Nile, I mean metaphorically speaking. It could not survive a week. So if the price is to keep a peace treaty with Israel for now, that price has to be paid.
Muchas gracias por sus explicaciones tan interesantes. Antes yo le voy a hablar de 3 puntos que están perfectamente relacionados.
Perdón, preguntas.
Preguntas, sí. La ambigüedad de Obama, por una parte, tiene como contrapartida 69% del voto judío en los Estados Unidos. 2, la guerra posible contra Irán. Israel se convertirá entonces en el culpable de la Tercera Guerra Mundial. Y tercer punto, ¿no cree que el conflicto realmente es un conflicto entre el mundo extremista islámico y Occidente? Y si esto está relacionado, ¿cuál es la solución? ¿Qué podemos hacer para defender nuestros valores?
Thank you for your question. It's quite complex. Let's begin with your first point regarding President Obama. And why did the Jews, nearly 70%, if I understand, vote for Obama? As you know, Jews have traditionally, certainly since the 1930s, perhaps over a much longer period, voted for the Democratic Party in large numbers. I think that the highest vote that the Republican Party in the United States ever received from American Jews was President Reagan in the 1980s, and he received 35%, so even he did not get a majority of Jewish votes. Jews in America, politically speaking, seem to have the Democrat orientation in their cultural political DNA, if you like. And only a minority seem convinced by the Republican outlook. And there are some good reasons for that. There are also some surprising aspects to it. Somebody once said a very acute observation about the way American Jews vote. He said that they have an income level which is equivalent to the Episcopalians, who are the richest of all the Protestant denominations, but they vote like Puerto Ricans, who are the poorest group in the United States, and vote for the Democrats. And that's true. Jews are an exception because Jews are much more liberal on the whole than average Americans. And it's very interesting when surveys were done of how Protestants and Catholics vote, white Protestants and white Catholics vote, they are overwhelmingly closer to the Republican Party today. So that's, I think, the explanation. I do think that it also shows that Israel is not the number one issue, or maybe not even the second or third most important issue for the majority of American Jews. Because if it was, I would find it difficult to believe that they would favor Obama, even though things are not black and white in that regard. Forgive the metaphor, they're not black and white. The second point was, what was the second point? Iran. Yes, I understand. I remember now. Iran. First of all, we don't know whether this would necessarily ignite a third world war. We don't know that for sure. It's a possibility, but it's not a certainty. It's not a certainty. I think that Israel finds itself today in an agonizing geopolitical dilemma. Because if you look in a very objective way at the countries which surround it in the Middle East and at Iran as well, which has no border, of course, with Israel, which is far away, but which has missiles that can reach Israel, it now finds itself for the first time in 64 years surrounded by countries which are either controlled directly or indirectly by fundamentalist Islamists who totally negate Israel's right to exist, or by countries which could very easily fall into their hands. Egypt, which under Mubarak, I'm not making any judgment about whether Mubarak was good for Egypt, but with regard to Israel, he kept the treaty and he had no intention of changing it. Now, as I indicated before, it's hanging by a thread. And Egypt, if it ever contemplated war with Israel, would be a very formidable opponent because of its size and because it's been armed by American arms. Then we have Lebanon, which is in the grip of the Hezbollah. Lebanon is a failed state. It's not really a state anymore. The largest armed force in Lebanon is Hezbollah. It's much stronger than the Lebanese army. Hezbollah has already fought one war with Israel in 2006. Hezbollah is armed with 50,000 plus missiles, all of which can reach Israeli territory. That means that any war with Iran, this I just say as a kind of amateur strategist, anybody knows this. If there would be a war with Iran, one of the first things Israel would have to do, it would have no choice, it would have to smash completely all of Hezbollah's capacity, which would mean an all-out bombing of Lebanon, but not in the way that it was done in 2006, which was already very controversial, but it would have to destroy the whole infrastructure of Lebanon because Hezbollah today controls Lebanon in a way it did not do in 2006. So when you have an opponent that can fire 50,000 missiles potentially onto your territory and would have no hesitation to do so, then you have to neutralize that straight away because Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. It's financed, it's armed, it's supported, and it's controlled by Iran. So, and then you look at Syria. Syria in the middle of a ghastly, horrific civil war with a brutal regime, but not exceptional by Arab standards. Assad is simply demonstrating that he is a true son of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who without hesitation in 1982, in fact, bombed to pieces a whole Syrian city where you had a Muslim Brotherhood stronghold. And he is actually less cruel and bloodthirsty, although he's bad enough, than Saddam Hussein was when it came to dealing with his own people. So this is not exceptional by Arab standards. These are facts. Now, Syria could also fall into the hands of the Islamists. It's a horrible choice from an Israeli point of view. That's why they're silent, why Israel says nothing, because it knows that whatever could come to power, whoever would come to power in place of Bashar al-Assad, could be even worse for Israel. Because Bashar al-Assad is a butcher. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, he kept the peace on the Golan since 1974. That's almost 40 years. I mean, he didn't do it personally. His father did it, and he continued with it. So that's an awful dilemma. Jordan could collapse, although somehow they've always managed to survive these crises, but we don't know whether they could do it now. So Iran, nothing has changed, except that every day they get just a little closer to nuclearization. And that nuclearization is, the people say, you know, of course it's a major threat to Israel, but it's an even bigger threat to the Arab states in the Gulf, because then they will be completely exposed to Iranian blackmail. And the Iranians are very good blackmailers, and they know that. Will there be a war? I don't trust President Obama to do anything beyond the methods he's employing. Will these sanctions, if they are stronger and the European Union has gone along with it, will they produce a result? They are painful. They're making the ordinary Iranian citizens suffer, no doubt about it. They won't stop the nuclearization program. We know that from the evidence of history. Did it stop North Korea? Did the United States stop North Korea? If it can't stop North Korea, it can't stop Iran. The third point?
It's not for today.
Not for today, the third point, the chairman says. I forgot what it was, though. What was that?
It was what to do.
What to do is not for
Il
today.
tercer punto era simplemente che
¿Qué hacer?
en
Perdón, pero es que
en un conflicto,
tenemos que
sí.
agradecer al profesor Robert. Thank you very much, Professor Robert, for very interesting. Moltes gràcies a tots i fins a la propera.